lead instructor of design at Flatiron, who actually started her career as a front-end developer. So we're going to learn how to talk a little bit better to each other, and hopefully you can get some takeaways as well.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so as Chris said, I'm a lead design instructor here at the Flatiron campus in San Francisco. If anyone has any questions about our bootcamp design specific, feel free to come talk to me after the presentation. Don't want to press into a marketing spiel, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I see a few of my students in the audience as well. So shout out to them, and they are also around to ask questions if you can figure out who they are. Thanks.
Okay, so I'd like to start off with a little icebreaker. For those of you who don't know me, I started my career not as a user experience designer, but as a building architect. So it wasn't long ago that I looked something like this. Now, granted, this was Halloween. I was dressed up like a famous American architect, but back then, this is sort of what the concept of software development seemed like to me, that we were living in the matrix and we were looking at a bunch of green code. So needless to say, I'd like to demystify that to the designers out here tonight. So together we've put together sort of a 101 of how you can interact with developers. And we've broken up into 7 key steps. Number 1, what questions should you ask the first time you meet the development team? 2, is it even appropriate to ask to see their past work? 3, what are the different types of developers? 4, what if they don't say anything at all? 5, how should we be interacting generally week over week in the context of sprints? 6, do I as a designer need to learn the code? And finally, what do they expect from me as the designer? So the first point is sort of what questions do I ask the first time we meet?
So I know you're super excited about whatever project you're working on and you just want to go straight into projects specifics, but you know, we're all people, so please build a little rapport with your fellow teammates, software engineers, developers at first. You know, the little chit chat can be useful. You know, where are you from? What kind of, you know, we like to say coffee or tea. Here at Flatiron, we have a big tea cohort. Little things like that to get to know each other first and build a little rapport, things you have in common, so you can start speaking each other's language and feel comfortable with each other.
Excellent, yes. And for, if any reason rapport seemed to be a challenge, I have broken up into 5 sort of silos of discussion. So the first is defining the roles. We're all seated around the table. Who here is doing the front-end development? This is the person who's going to probably be responsible for the UI you're crafting. Who's doing back-end? You know, I'm sure some of you in the audience, this is old news, but for those who might be a bit newer to the industry, this is the person who's going to be managing the database and facilitating, serving up the relevant information to the front end. Ultimately, who's doing QA? You might have a special relationship with this person as the designer because they're going to be the one making sure your screens are implemented correctly. DevOps, this is going to be the developer who's responsible for giving you necessary accesses to things like a private server or something like that. And then also, who's the Scrum Master? This person, if you're using a Scrum methodology, will unite us all. The Scrum Master should be a amiable character, and generally, they'll be the ones that lead the daily stand-ups. So now that we know who each other is, if we're about to kick off the project, what screen sizes are we even designing for? As I'm sure you're all familiar with, there's a great difference between an iPhone 5 SE screen up to an iPad Pro 12.9 inch. So the implications this actually has from a development perspective, besides the size of your artboards and Sketch or Figma, is really what CSS frameworks use. Now, you might have heard things like Bootstrap or Foundation, but here's really all the variations that can be used. And while this is a lot of just technical information, what's relevant to us as designers is how many columns are in our grid. So we recommend, if you're creating mobile responsive design, that you craft each screen with the concept of vertical columns. To specify the break, we actually recommend a 16. So it's important to know what CSS framework your development team intends to use for this project. Then, ultimately, there's this concept of shortcuts. So as we're discussing, about to kick off a project, are there any commercially available library third-party plugins that we might want to use as opposed to making the development team code from scratch. The reason this is important to us as designers is you might have to work with special constraints. If you're going to use a pre-built messaging platform or some other element, you might have to modify your design slightly. And then ultimately, the concept of blockers. When you're meeting around the table, does everyone have the necessary access they need? Sometimes you might find that your team puts certain like staging servers behind an IP wall. And ultimately, although this might go without saying, what's the definition of done? Perhaps it sounds kind of silly, but knowing what is our benchmark and what is our North Star is important. For instance, we might design a vast series of flows, but we need to understand as a group, what are the showstoppers that if we don't develop and QA successfully, this product is not a release candidate.
Are you going to make this available, the slide deck?
Sure, if you'd like it. Yeah, there's nothing really proprietary. There'll also be a YouTube video if you'd like to go search for Neuron UX on YouTube. So then the question of, I ask them to show me their past work?
I think Chris and I are unanimous on this. Why, yes. Yes, please do. What they show you may not look beautiful, but it'll give you a sense of what capabilities they are already comfortable working with and what kind of functionality they can build without having to explain things to you, such as frameworks that you might not understand. But Chris will wrap it up with a better explanation.
Right, so, I don't speak code. Well, that's not a problem because there's certain elements of a developer's daily work product that you will be able to understand. One of which is folder structure. So what's kind of cool about this example on the right is that this is the steps of a sort of checkout flow. You can imagine it's a breadcrumb linear process. But the developer I work with organized things into easily understandable folders for the logo step, add signature, approval. This is a structure that's actually speaking to the user benefit and just not related to some other syntax that they came up with. This folder structure speaks to what I laid out in Figma. And what this means in terms of is this good code or a good workflow is you can imagine if it makes sense to me without my knowledge of development, that another developer will be able to jump in and easily know where they need to navigate to because the folder structure is legible. Another thing I want to bring this back to the confines of UX and what we do is we develop or we design mobile pop-ups. So you can imagine often we're tasked with creating a design system, something that's extensible. We're going to create components, repeated elements, especially if we're creating a sort of web app or something with a lot of complex interactions. So in terms of a development perspective, it's best that they label this something like popup.open. Something that's a generic term. We don't want to name this type of asset something like congratulations.open, even in this case if it's the final congratulations pop-up, because if this is going to be an extensible system, the naming of repeated elements like a modal pop-up should have equally generic naming. So then what are the different types of developers? So there's the front-end developer. That's what Julia was doing in a past life. And you can think of that as working on the client side. This is the front-end markup, the visual layer of the app on your phone, and there's the back-end responsible for the server and serving up the relevant data. But then there's this concept, you might have heard of the full stack, don't worry, I'm a unicorn. And Julia's development expertise has some thoughts about this.
Yes, Chris had to rein me in a little because I have a lot of thoughts on this. So full stack, depending on whether they mean front end and back end dev, or the whole designer, front end dev, back end dev, full stack. Keep in mind, if you want something done well, you've hopefully hired someone with expertise and specialty. If you were to be a full stack designer or developer, then you've spent 30,000 hours learning how to do that. Have you ever had a job that paid you money? Or were you too busy learning? With expertise, if you're getting a unicorn, then you're getting someone with a lot of breadth but no depth of knowledge and may not be very good at certain parts of those roles that they say they're good at. So it can be a double-edged sword.
Right, and this can be important, especially for us sort of OCD UX designers. You might be unhappy if that person's not a front-end expert, that what is produced might actually be pixel perfect, which in some cases might be fine, but depending on the refinement you're looking for, you might want a dedicated front-end development. So I have a little project prompt for us, and we're going to be working on a neighborhood pizzeria website. Okay, so we understand largely the goals, what's on the menu here, what's the address, some photos of cheese and sauce. Well, here's a little meme about how we can look at this in terms of development. So we start off with like, let's just build a Wix. This could probably be a Squarespace or something, right? We're just putting up cheese photos. But then maybe you want a little bit more control. Well, this can probably be done with HTML and CSS. One thing that should be a little bit of a warning sign if you're interacting is that maybe we should use a React JavaScript library for the pizza website. I would simply say that a library like React.js is really intended for web apps or something that's very broad, extensive systems. We don't need it for a simple marketing website. There's this custom server-side, which I include this in for fun. But you might notice for some of your bigger apps on your devices that before the data is loaded on a screen, before the sauce loads. So next, what happens if the developers just aren't communicating with the design team? So we broke this into kind of two phases, the pre-development phase and then when we're mid-sprint, the communication stops. So if we're pre-development, one thing you can start talking about once you build some rapport is what parts of your design are flexible. Because often they'll produce an hour estimate and they might not know or ask like what parts of this could we maybe compromise a little bit of design to speed things up and get it done. So you can, as a team, see if there aren't and everything's gone silent. You can always ask them to open up an emulator like the one Xcode by Apple provides if you're designing for an Apple iOS app. Essentially, if you're evaluating something in an emulator, it's simply easier for them to do that and compile, build, and send it to you. So if you're working with a website, maybe ask them to show you a small HTML layout. In this way, it will be a huge time saver in the long run when you have more iterative design QA process as opposed to coming all the way to the end of the sprint when you actually have a release candidate, but the buttons are all not as designed. Yes, so that really covers some things to talk about. So generally speaking, once everything is kind of swimming along, what's the best way to interact with developers? So in general, even outside of the tech product world, regular communication between any team is critical for success and alignment. So this happens, number one, with in-person communication if possible. Number two, in chat communication like Slack. And number three, video conferencing via Skype or Zoom. Now, I think the key thing for all of you to consider if you are making decisions for the development team, Slack, for the benefit of your QA team, for the benefit of the person writing out the test cases, implemented as such, QA is going to be pretty confused at the end if that's not actually well tracked. So Julie was telling me actually just recently, she sort of reorganized her sprints into Wednesdays, right? And what this layout shows is how we together feel the best sprint methodology works. So we were explaining kind of what happens if a sprint ends on a Friday.
You get to work all weekend, have fun, and it's like an every weekend kind of thing. There's always something wrong when a release goes out. Something always happens. And as the designer, you might not think you're like on call to do anything, but that's the dev's job. You gotta help out. You gotta be there to answer those decisions that Chris was just talking about. And so you're getting a lot of calls, a lot of Slack messages. Don't do it on a Friday.
Yeah, I mean, basically our recommendation is Wednesday, because that way there's still some days for some more demos, some design validation, and then we can say, yes, this is a release candidate. It only hurts everyone if it's on Friday sprint. And that might not be your decision to make what the sprint is, but if anyone's giving you the opportunity to input, recommend a Wednesday. So do I need to learn to code? This is kind of the ultimate question. Maybe you feel like you're seated around the table and it's a bit of a shortcoming. But I think this plays into what you were saying before.
Yeah, so once again, back to the full stack unicorn or the specialist, it takes a lot of effort to become really good at something. And you want me to just be half good? something, or do you want to have actual expertise in the job? So if you're at a job interview and someone's like, oh, why don't you code or something like that? Well, do you want a really good designer or do you want a really good developer? That's always a pretty good response.
Yeah. And one interesting thing that is emerging at some of these larger product companies, this sort of design development continuum. So if anything, as opposed to being a unicorn, they're further specializing. So you could be a visual designer purely responsible for maintaining the design system guidelines. Interaction, designing for the little animations that bring to light and joy the users. You could be a traditional user experience designer. You might be working wireframe capacity, information architecture, creating prototypes. So the one thing that is kind of emerging is the UX engineering. And this is the UX designer that knows how to code, but it's actually more likely that they back into the UX. They front-end developer with a real sensitivity for creating pixel-perfect implementations. And this can actually be cool because it can allow them to create prototypes that are perfectly pixel perfect and also allow you to validate that with users before you actually have to truly build out the whole system and connect it to any back-end APIs. So if anything, specialization is the trend as opposed to saying that you do all four of the first of these items. So then there's the question, we understand we're specialists now. I am a designer. What is the development team expecting? So fundamentally, documentation. I think we commonly think of wireframes, handed off in something like Sketch or Figma, but I would encourage you all to consider the more information architecture elements of this, the sitemaps, the feature sets. We'll get into this a bit more. The wireframes inclusive of prototypes and mock-ups, and then ultimately handoff. So when I say sitemaps, you might be thinking a more traditional XML sitemap in terms of the way a search engine crawls a website. It's sort of just categorizing all the pages of the site. Well, for us as visual thinkers, we can do something like this that outlines what are the top level navigation items, sort of represented here in blue, sub-navigation, and so on. This can be a great way to sort of think at a high level, 30,000 foot view, what are all the elements that make up this digital experience? And then when it comes to a feature set, this is simply a bulleted list. You can think of doing this in something like Google Docs or Microsoft Word, where you're listing out all the affordances on a given screen. And what's really nice about this is that, especially if you're doing it in Google Docs, is something that even if people on your team aren't designers or aren't even developers for a large stakeholder, they can interact with that document, make comments, and give input. So you can talk at sort of a bulleted level about what we're looking to achieve here. And then there's the topic of wireframes.
So any good designer should start at the sketch level. We see a balsamic mock-up here. Not quite pen and paper sketching, but definitely start there. Now they're not going to usually hand those sketches off to the developer. There are some few edge cases, but I won't go into those. But you should be handing off, as Chris mentioned earlier, what grid are you using? What is the padding and margins? How are things laid out? What is the visual hierarchy? Wireframes are also good for documenting functionality that maybe you can't express in a prototyping tool such as Envision or something like that. Annotations are also good for creating notes about your design decisions and why you did what you did to help understand to the different people reading the documents what the design should be and your design intent. The developer may not care as much about that, but it can help them see what to build very quickly. So definitely wireframes, annotated, your grid layout, visual hierarchy are very important.
Definitely. And then when it comes to those Figma or Zeppelin files, you might start out naming your layers, things like artwork copy or flat icon that you downloaded for free under the number 7, button share copy file, but it's really important that we get to something like this, where you start naming the assets or layers really specific, like button underscore share. This way, when the development team goes to export this as a PNG or SVG for implementing the actual code, it's going to have a logical taxonomy that they can find quickly what they're looking for. So that sort of concludes our 7 points. We're happy to answer any questions you might have, but we think this is a good starting point, a 101, if you will. This might help you whether you're a UX designer freelancer or working in a larger product company, and definitely Julia and I will be around afterwards if you have any further questions. And if you enjoyed today's presentation, feel free to open up your QR reader and write us a little review on Google. I guess in the meantime, though, if you have any questions, maybe we can take a couple from the audience. Anyone have a question?
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I had a question about redlining or annotations. What kind of examples do you have examples, or can you give more description to those? That's for me.
Yeah, so redlining, people are not familiar with that, is taking your visual design mockup and using literally magenta or red lines in, say, Photoshop or Sketch or Figma, and indicating padding and margins and spacing for every single element on the screen. That's not as common anymore because of tools like Zeppelin and Figma. They will export that for you, and you can share that with the developer. So luckily it's not as a painstaking process as it used to be. So definitely things like the CSS that would control those padding and stuff, I would suggest Zeppelin and Figma. But annotations are good, like you do a prototype in Vision, there's pretty limited functionality for what you can do. Obviously, you can use another tool that's more powerful, but unless you're going to code HTML and CSS and JavaScript, there's nothing that's going to be as good. So I definitely still recommend wireframe annotations to call out that functionality. It's also especially good for doing different states of screens. It's easier to do those in a wireframing tool than to program all of them. Did that answer your question, by the way?
So you talked about it a little bit, but what's the difference between a front-end engineer and a user experience engineer?
Sure.
Oh yes, so UX engineer and front-end dev are actually pretty much the same, but UX engineer, as Chris said, has more of a design UX sensibility. They may have actually even gone to a design bootcamp or taken some UX courses. So it's not like they're gonna whip out those sitemaps and user flows and wireframes, but they know enough like how to render the design intent behind something, and they're more likely to get your designs as a designer pixel perfect, as Chris was mentioning, than someone who's a straight engineer. They just have a little more empathy for you, and it's actually becoming a pretty popular role, as Chris said, especially in bigger organizations, as someone who sits on the design team and does the prototyping instead of using like InVision or Axure or Figma.
Any other questions? I got.
Hey, thanks for the presentation, guys. That was really good. Could you go back to the last slide that you had?
This one or the
One right before that. So as you know, sometimes it will be a final, but then some discussion will happen, and then you'll have to come back and change it. Do you then just retitle it as that, and then does there become a confusion there on like which one is the final one if they're both titled the same?
You had another final.
Final 2, 3,
Like
1.
for real.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I think this actually goes back to the pushing everything upstream to Jira. What I've found, if a repeated element like button underscore back does change, what I have done is just make sure that I actually directly add to the Jira ticket the 1x, 2x, 3x PNG of the back button. Because now that is the artifact of truth, right? So that way, like, even though they might have had the first receivable file receive one thing, you just make sure it's really tracked in Jira, that they know that now this is what they should be using. I mean, in terms of whether that answers your question, how you name it in Figma itself, I think that's up to you. I like to create like a separate page for like kind of an archived element but in terms of how we're interacting with our team, to make sure that's easier.
Cool thing.
Any other questions?
Hi. What kind of language do you use when you might hand off a design and the developer might be saying stuff like, well, can we if we move this button over here and we maybe take out this screen, I'll be able to build it a little faster. Do we really need this interaction? What do you when do you bend and when do you not bend?
If it's a question of color, I have one silver bullet for you. Try to tie it back to accessibility. As you know, in the realm of accessibility, you're trying to aim for certain color contrast ratios. If for any reason something's going like a cyan button with white text, there you go. That's a 2 point something contrast, and you can't do that. It needs to be 3+. Now, if it's a question more broadly of whether their sort of compromise is actually just deprecated by your sacrifice of design, I think you need to let them proceed with their decision. But I think, especially if it's in the context of not just the one user benefits, not burdened, or on the contrary, we really need to do this for X, Y, and Z. That's how you should frame that conversation, because ultimately,
Amazing. This is what question might be for you. So imagine you are a designer and you have someone who is a UXE front-end dev, and they have opinions that might be out of their realm. It's kind of the question, but a little bit more so how do you navigate this is your role, this is my role, whether you have gone to a class or course or two, but how do you kind of live in that gray zone and keep it motivated?
Yeah, it's always a trade-off. So I'm gonna sort of actually add an answer to the other question. Sorry, that. So it's a trade-off. And so honestly, if I had a developer that was oh, can we cut the screen or can we do this interaction? A lot like Chris said, I always go back to accessibility. I also go back to the user research. So also to your point. And then I also what else can I trade off? If it's gonna cost more effort to build this, what can I cut maybe somewhere else that doesn't degrade the user experience? So sort of the same thing, I wouldn't worry too much about defining roles. Remember, we all have the same goal. It's the best experience for the user. And so hopefully ego should stay out of it. I'm not saying it always does, but try and work collaboratively, and you can pipe in with some new library you read about or something like that that may help him code faster, or she, sorry. Look at it more we all have the same goal, let's work on this together. If they're saying things that are just, really not beneficial for the overall experience and are just coming at it from a totally different angle, always go back to the user research and the personas and the journey map. If you don't have those, I use user research, I use accessibility, I use statistics, I use white papers, get anything you can, any data that you can provide to convince that person. Does that answer your question?
excellent. Well, because we are a community after all here at being UX, Marciano would like to talk to you about a little time tracking tool he's working on that he would like some user experience help with. So, Jimmy, please.
Hello, everybody. Good job, Chris. Thank you for your presentation as well. Thank you to Flatiron School. What I have going on is I'm a developer, and I started out as wanting to be a designer, but I'm a developer now, front end, and I'm working on a React app that is a tracker and psychological model and stuff like that. I do need a little bit of help with the project from UX designers, and the time commitment would be about 12 to 16 hours. Maybe whatever you can contribute to the project. We can talk about any differences. And what I have so far to date is research, which I've done, and competitive analysis, a prototype in React.js, and I'm also working on an MVP prototype, but once I find a team or a few UX designers who might be interested in contributing, I might change the actual concept depending on what research I find for the MVP, and which was suggested to me by a UX designer actually. And so the roadmap is basically three weeks of commitment, with the first week being the wireframes, second week being the user testing, hopefully with the wireframes, and also the last week just visual design with an interaction designer. And that's about it for me. If you do have any interest in joining in on the project, you can talk to me afterwards. You can also find me on, I can give you a card, or you can also email me at rotimi@rotimicreative.com.
So yes, now that we all know how to talk to developers, we have a real live front-end developer right here at Rotimi. So now's the chance to practice everything we learned tonight with him. So thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I know we haven't done one of these in a while, but if you're new here, you came via Eventbrite or otherwise, another QR code opportunity here, please join our meetup group of over 1,200 beer UX enthusiasts. Not sure if there's any pizza left, but there might be beer. So that's all, Julie and I hope you guys have a good night.